Hello and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we will continue our reading of Storm in the Village by Miss Reed. Hilary Jackson, with the sun full upon her face, zigzagged laboriously up the chalky cart track. She had to keep carefully to the middle of the pathway, for the ruts made by farm carts and tractors were deep and dangerous. Ahead she could see the welcome shade of the wood. Behind her rose a light cloud of chalky dust sent up by her bicycle wheels. The path grew steeper, and some distance before it entered the wood, the girl gave up pedaling and dismounted. It was very quiet. The fields sloped down to the Fairacre Road, which shimmered in the distance. The warm air was murmurous with the humming of myriad wings, and beside her, as she wandered with one hot hand on the handlebars, two blue butterflies skirmished together above the tall pollen-dusty grass. Her head throbbed with exertion, but also with excitement. Very soon she knew she would be approaching the cottage where John Franklin, the gamekeeper, lived. His daughter Betty was now safely with the aunt in Caxley, and he would be alone in the little house. She looked at her watch. It said 20 minutes past 5. With any luck, he would be at home, and perhaps he would speak to her. She quickened her pace, steadied Miss Clare's parcel, which swayed across the bicycle basket, and entered the woods. It was like stepping into an old church from a sunny field. The sudden chill raised goose-flesh on the girl's scorched arms, and the sudden quiet gloom after the singing brightness of the chalky fields created a feeling of awe. The companionable murmuring of the insects had gone, and silence engulfed her. The trees stood straight and tall, menacingly aloof, and to the girl, in her high-strung state, they appeared like watchful sentinels who passed and repassed each other in the distance as she moved nervously between them. On each side of the path, festoons of small-leaved honeysuckle draped low branches of hazel bushes, and the cloying sweetness of its perfume blended with the moist fragrance compounded of damp earth, moss, and the resinous breath of many close-packed trees. The path was damp beneath her feet and muffled the sound made by her sandals and the wheels of the bicycle. To give herself courage, Miss Jackson looked at her watch again. Why, it was still really afternoon. Nothing to fear in a wood at 5:30. If the watch had said midnight now. She had a sudden terrifying picture of inky trees, a slimy path, and a furtive, leering, sickening moon sliding behind crooked branches. Owls would be abroad, screeching and clacking, and bats, deformed and misshapen, would leave their topsy-turvy slumbers and swoop out upon their horrid business. She took a deep, shuddering breath, pushed such fancies resolutely behind her, and in 2 minutes had reached the bend of the lane which brought her within sight of the gamekeeper's cottage. It stood quite close to the path, tucked into the side of a steep slope which rose sharply behind it. The garden was narrow and lay to the side of the house, bordering the track through the woods. The currant bushes were heavy with fruit, and the acid smell of black currants was wafted to the girl as she dawdled past. She noticed the tidy rows of vegetables, the 2 apple trees, sprucely pruned and already bearing a crop of small green apples. A rough shed, painted with tar to protect it from the dripping of the surrounding trees, stood at the far end of the garden. Hilary could see that the door was shut and the padlock fastened as she passed it by. She looked at the cottage hopefully, but her heart sank as she noticed the closed windows and doors. She could see no movement anywhere. The windows were dirty, and the curtains looked grubby. Clearly, the mistress of the house was here no more, and the neglected dwelling place contrasted strongly with the trim garden in which it stood. Disappointment flooded the girl's heart, but relief too, for she half realized that she felt fear as well as infatuation for this odd, soft-spoken man who had noticed her. She was now past the house, rising steadily until in a few moments she could stop and look down upon its tiled roof, stained with lichens and bird droppings and streaked with murky tears shed by the trees overhead. In a dappled patch of sunlight at the side of the house, she could now see a small tabby kitten rolling luxuriously in some dry earth beneath a jutting windowsill. It looked up, startled, as she chirruped to it, and fled helter-skelter out of sight. At the top of the hill, Hilary Jackson paused for breath and looked down upon the hamlet of Springboard, scattered below in the valley. Ah, there was Mrs. Chard's white house, with the pine tree at its gate, just as Miss Clare had said. She smoothed her yellow frock, adjusted the parcel once more, and clambered up into the saddle. The wind rushed past her, cooling her flushed face and quieting her restless heart. Within 5 minutes, she was pushing open Mrs. Chard's green gate and approaching the open door. Chapter 8. The Gamekeeper's Cottage. While Hilary Jackson sat in Mrs. Chard's cool green and white drawing room, sipping a glass of lemon squash and listening to her hostess's ecstatic comments as she unpacked the parcel of jumble, the vicar of Fairacre was talking to Mr. Maughan. The two men lay back in deck chairs in the shade of a fine copper beech which John Parr's great-grandfather had planted. Upon Mr. Maughan's chest were lodged his binoculars, which he frequently clapped to his eyes, the better to observe some distant bird on the far side of the garden. Upon the vicar's chest lay folded his hands, pink and damp with heat, and above them his mild old face looked aloft worriedly. "And Philpotts should know," he was saying. "He is one of the chaps on the Rural District Council and a most reliable fellow." "Shh, shh," hissed his companion, adjusting his binoculars and making his deck chair emit noises far more violent than his friend's gentle voice. The vicar was obediently quiet until the binoculars were lowered again. "It means," continued the vicar in a gusty whisper, "that the Rural District Council has seen the plans, and there's no doubt about it that a school will be needed on the site." He sighed heavily, and a blackbird rattled from a hawthorn tree, scolding and squawking madly. The vicar looked penitent. "I'm so sorry, my dear Maughan. Another bird that I've scared, I'm afraid." "That's nothing," said Mr. Maughan indulgently. "Carry on. So what's worrying you?" "Why, my school," said the vicar, sitting up suddenly bolt upright and turning his wide-open eyes upon his friend. "Don't you see? It may mean that our children are taken by bus to this new school, and Fairacre School may close." "I don't believe it," said Mr. Maughan with conviction. "Fairacre School won't be closed as long as the parents want it to stay open." "I hope you're right. Indeed, I hope you're right," said Mr. Partridge in a troubled voice. "But the numbers have dwindled to almost 30, and I don't know." His voice trailed away unhappily. Silence fell between the two men. Far away a cow lowed, and a tiny stealthy sound from the hawthorn tree made Mr. Maughan raise his binoculars again and scrutinize it for some minutes. Finally he lowered them, pulled the strap over his head, and replaced them in the leather case which lay on the grass at his feet. He spoke with decision. "I think you're worrying yourself unnecessarily. But to put your mind at rest, why don't you go and see someone at the county council offices and see what the plans are for your school and Beech Greens?" "That's an idea," responded the vicar slowly. "The local authority will have the job of providing the new school," went on Mr. Maughan, snapping the clasp on his binoculars, "and they'll know what's happening to the existing schools if this business goes through." He looked at his old friend and clapped him on the shoulder. "Cheer up," he said, struggling from his deck chair. "Come and have a glass of sherry. The gnats are getting to me." He held out his hand to the vicar and hauled him to his feet. "You've given me new heart," confessed the vicar as they made their way into the house. "I'll do that." A sudden jangling of church bells broke out in the distance. "Bless my soul!" exclaimed the vicar. 6:30 already. The bell ringers have started practicing promptly tonight." He sank back into an armchair and accepted the glass of sherry which his friend carried over to him with great care. "You're a good fellow, Maughan," he said. "You've comforted me with words, and now with wine." He raised his glass to his host before he sipped. The sound of the bells ringing floated across the warm evening air to Hilary Jackson as she made her return journey. The slope up from the Springborn Valley was shorter but steeper than that from the Fairacre Road, and the girl was obliged to go on foot, wheeling her dusty bicycle. Her thoughts raced ahead of her slow feet. Would he be back yet? Should she knock at his door? She was torn between a wild, strange excitement which drove her on, and nagging doubts, half fearful, which held her back. Hilary Jackson was in love for the first time. For a girl of 20-odd, she had very little experience of men. An only child, educated at a girls' school and going from thence straight on to a women's training college, where the redoubtable Miss Crabbe had engaged her affections and admiration, she had little occasion to mix with the opposite sex. John Franklin's casual attentions had lit a greater fire than she would ever guess in the foolish heart of this girl. Despite rumors which rumbled round Fairacre and which were causing Miss Clare and Miss Reed such heartburning, the meeting of the two had been by chance, except on the occasion of the visit to the cinema. John Franklin had been pleasantly surprised by the ardor with which his casual invitation had been accepted. He flirted as a matter of course with any woman, but with young Miss Jackson he had tempered his usual bonhomie with a certain amount of reserve, due, he felt, to the teacher of his daughter. He had not bargained for the response that he had received, and truth to tell was half embarrassed by it. Like all countrymen, he wished to avoid trouble, and he disliked the sly teasings which he feared might get to the ears of his sister in Caxley, who was giving a home to his child. It would look bad to have this girl tagging after him, he told himself, but at the same time his vanity was flattered. He had loved his wife, and he missed her sorely, and though he had no intention of asking Hilary Jackson to become his second, he was in need of comfort and tempted to accept it at the moment from any source. As Hilary Jackson approached the cottage, she became conscious of the homely smell of frying onions. The door of the tarred shed now stood open, and the little cat was lapping at a saucer of milk set out on the brick path near the back door. The girl stood irresolute and called softly to the cat. At that moment, John Franklin emerged with an armful of sticks from the shed. Hilary called out joyfully, "Hello, your supper smells good." "Want some?" replied the man, half jocularly. Construing this as an invitation to the house, Hilary propped her bicycle against the fence and entered the garden. John Franklin watched her with mingled dismay and pleasure. She was an awkward great lump of a girl, he told himself, his eyes on her thick ankles and broad flat sandals, but her feelings seemed warm enough. He motioned her to enter the kitchen and followed her in. "What have you been up to?" he asked, dumping the sticks on the top of an old copper which stood in the corner. His tone was bantering. Hilary told him breathlessly of her errand, her eyes roaming round the little room. Sizzling on a Primus stove stood a gargantuan frying pan full of onions. On a white enamel plate nearby lay 2 freshly cooked rashers, the biggest and thickest the girl had ever seen. A 3-pronged small fork and a pointed knife with a horn handle flanked the plate, and a bottle of sauce and a bottle of beer stood before it. "Take a seat," said John Franklin, nodding toward a kitchen chair by the table. It was obviously little used, for it was thick with dust. Too flustered to bother about its effect on her yellow frock, the girl settled herself and watched the man turning the onions over and over with the small fork. The room, after the brilliant sunshine outside, was murky, but her eyes became accustomed to the gloom, and Hilary noticed the dust was general. The window-sill was thickly coated, and a dead geranium, whose leaves crackled under her touch, was a silent, sad memorial to the dead mistress of the house. The window looked out upon a damp wall made of flints, which acted as a barrier against the shifting soil of the steep slope of the wood against which the cottage had been built so snugly. The wall was so close that even short-sighted Hilary could see the holes in the ancient flints quite clearly. All her senses seemed acutely sharpened. She noticed, as she had never done before, that the chalky covering of each gray flint caused a milky edge round the transverse section, and that many of the jagged holes in the flints were filled with a glistening, granulated substance that looked like thick honey. Tiny ferns grew in the crevices, and some small mauve flowers, unknown to the girl, cascaded down the damp surface. A little movement attracted her notice. Close beside a ribbed hart's tongue fern, which lolled from the mouth of a miniature cavern, squatted a toad. She saw his coppery eyes gleaming above the pulsing throat. Shivering, the girl turned again to the domestic scene before her. John Franklin was now lifting the onions from the pan, and a second plate lay beside the first. "Oh, please," begged Hilary, "I don't really want any of your supper. I thought you were joking." "Plenty here," said the man, lading it out carefully. "I couldn't honestly," protested the girl, her eye lit on the bottle. "But I'd love something to drink." "Beer do?" he asked, pausing in his operations. She nodded. He put down the frying pan and made his way out of the kitchen along a corridor to the front parlor. The girl could hear him opening and shutting doors and moving furniture. At last he returned, bearing a florid china mug with a picture of King Edward VII and Queen Alexandra on the side. He set it down before her and filled it, then poured the rest of the bottle into his own battered enamel mug. Hilary felt better after the first draught. She watched the man tackle his supper heartily, and though the noise he made in eating would have revolted her had it been anyone else, so besotted was she that his hungry gulpings perturbed her not a whit. He finished the plateful, scraped his knife carefully across the surface, then between the prongs of his fork, ate this last morsel, wiped his mouth on the back of his hand, and leant back in his chair. He looked at the girl from beneath his sandy eyelashes and smiled. "Ah, that's better. A chap gets sharp set out in the air all day." "I expect so," said Hilary, gazing at him fondly through her thick glasses. Half-remembered descriptions of strong, earthy men from the works of D.H. Lawrence and Mary Webb floated bemusedly through her head. She sipped her beer again. "Haven't seen much of you lately," continued John Franklin, raising his own drink. "What's up?" "Why, nothing," said Hilary. "I just haven't been to Caxley lately." She set her mug very carefully on the table, unable to meet his eyes, and Franklin put his hand over hers, bent across the table. Even the smell of onions could not quell the uproar in Miss Jackson's romantic heart. "You enjoyed our last evening there?" asked John Franklin softly. "Very much," faltered Hilary. The room seemed darker and hotter than ever. She lifted her mug with her free hand and drank deeply. "What about next Wednesday?" said the man. His face seemed amazingly close and very pink. "Good film on at the same place." He gripped Hilary's hand in a hot and rather painful grasp. Muzzy with unaccustomed beer and bliss, she leaned gently towards him. "Hi," said a shrill voice from the doorway. "What you want done with this lot?" A small boy, with a roll of wire netting lodged across his shoulder, gazed interestedly upon them. Miss Jackson recognized him with instant dismay as one of Miss Reed's pupils, although she did not know his name. She leapt to her feet and smoothed her dress nervously. Without any trace of embarrassment, John Franklin rose slowly from his chair and came to the door. "I'll give you a hand with it to the shed, son," he said mildly. "Tell your dad I'll settle up with him when I see him." The child stared at Hilary unblinkingly, his mouth slightly open. He lowered the wire netting, and between them he and the man carried it down the garden path. Hilary, trying to overcome her discomfiture, emerged into the sunlight as they returned. "You don't have to go yet," muttered John Franklin urgently. The child gazed from one to the other. The girl spoke primly and rather loudly. "I really must. Thank you very much for giving me a drink." John Franklin looked quizzically at her. The sun was getting low now, and his light sandy hair was turned to a fox-like tawny red by its rays. She knew that he was amused by her clumsy acting for the benefit of the child who gaped beside her, and this upset her. Even more upsetting was the breaking of that charmed spell, now shattered beyond hope of regaining. For one dreadful moment, the girl felt tears rise behind her thick glasses and prayed that they should not fall. John Franklin saw all and pressed home his advantage. "You're welcome to the drink," he said with loud heartiness. He turned to the boy. "Time you got back, Jim. Off you go." The child, still staring, edged slowly toward the gate, and Hilary, shaken with love and hurt pride, went with him. The man ambled slowly behind him and leant over the gate as he watched the girl lift her bicycle from the fence where it rested. He spoke very low and with his face averted from the laggard boy. "Wednesday, then? You'll come?" The girl could only trust herself to nod, eyes downcast. "Same time, same place?" he persisted. His voice gained a new urgency, which was music to her. "You'll come?" "I'll come," replied Hilary. The boy, who had come over the hill from Springborn, walked back up the slope from the gamekeeper's cottage with slow, thoughtful steps, his eyes fixed on the fast-moving figure of one of his school-teachers. A light cloud of chalk dust rose from behind her skimming wheels as she swooped down to the distant Fairacre Road. He remembered the scene in the murky cottage kitchen, and his eyes brightened. "Cool," he said rapturously aloud. For in matters of the heart, despite his tender years, he was not as green as he was cabbage-looking, as his mother would have said. As for Hilary, careering headlong toward Miss Clare's cottage with her slightly dizzy head a-whirl with dancing anticipation, what a pity it was that she had not taken heed of the moral to be found in the story that she had been reading to her infants that very afternoon. It was a tale of that foolish creature, Jemima Puddle Duck, who was so easily beguiled by a certain foxy gentleman. Well, we'll look further into this affair. We'll look further into this next time.